The winter of 1883 killed things that were supposed to be permanent. Emmett Voss understood this at 4 in the morning on the 24th of January, standing in his bedroom in the dark with his boots already on, listening to his house argue with itself. The joists overhead flexed against the cold. The window glass in the north-facing frames had contracted enough to pull away from their putty seals, and through those hairline gaps came a sound that was not quite wind, more like the territory itself exhaling through clenched teeth. He had built this house with Douglas fir hauled from Minnesota at considerable expense. He had built it with real glass windows and a stone foundation and a porch that faced west so a man could stand in the evening and look at what he'd made of the land below. He had built it to last. He crossed to the window and used his thumbnail to scrape a circle in the frost that had built up on the inside of the glass. Through that circle, maybe 30 feet of visibility before the storm swallowed everything. He couldn't see the new stable he knew stood 40 yards out, the one that had cost him $340 in 3 weeks of his best carpenter's time. The one he'd been proud of in the particular way he was proud of everything he constructed, which was the pride of a man who equated the quality of what he built with the quality of what he was. He angled his view upward toward Ridgeback Hill on the western edge of the flats. The smoke rose thin as a pencil line from the hillside. Straight up, not torn sideways the way every other wisp of anything was being torn in this wind, because it was rising from somewhere protected enough that the draft at its source was still clean and steady. It came from the ground itself, not from a chimney stack, not from any structure a reasonable person would recognize as a structure, but from the earth of the hill, which had been doing this since October, and would apparently keep doing it long after Emmett's firewood ran out, sometime before the next morning. He stood at the frost circle for longer than he meant to. 8 months ago, he had told that girl she wouldn't survive October. He pulled on his coat and went downstairs to count what remained of the wood. That was the 24th of January, 1883. The story of how the smoke got there begins 8 months earlier, on a morning in May, when the prairie grass along the Coulter Creek bottomland was just starting to show its first serious green, and a girl walked into Harrow Flats, Dakota Territory, carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag that had once held flour. Wren Calloway had been walking for 11 days. She was 17 years old with black hair thick enough to hold its own braid without pins, dark brown eyes that had the quality of arriving at conclusions before they'd finished looking, and skin that ran a shade deeper than her father's Scottish side, would account for the Osage half the half that had come from her mother who had died when Wren was 6 and left her with a stepfather in Topeka who had tolerated her presence for 11 years before deciding he no longer needed to. Her left shoe had worn through at the heel. The muscles along her spine had developed a specific burn that started each morning about an hour into walking and became background noise by noon. She had $18 sewn into the hem of her skirt, 2 years of domestic wages kept hidden in plain sight, the portion her stepfather hadn't managed to locate and redirect, and a letter at the bottom of her bag that she had read 3 times on the road without once deciding whether to burn it. Her stepfather's handwriting, which was the careful handwriting of a man who had learned to write late. "You are your mother's mistake. Don't come back." She had folded it each time and kept walking. Harrow Flats occupied a shallow basin in the eastern Dakota Territory, where the land flattened out so completely that you could stand at the edge of town and see weather coming for 40 minutes before it arrived. 35 households strung along 2 dirt roads that crossed at a right angle, with Mabel Storch's Mercantile at the corner occupying the largest wooden structure on either road. The settlement existed because the Homestead Act had told people that land was free if they were willing to fight for it, and the people who had come here had fought grasshoppers, drought, 3 previous hard winters, and had developed in the survival of those fights the specific stubbornness of people who have staked too much to admit they might be in the wrong place. They did not trust outsiders easily. They trusted young women arriving alone with visible pregnancies not at all. Wren pushed through the door of Mabel Storch's Mercantile and immediately understood the room. 6 men. 2 of them found something urgent to examine in the shelf of lamp oil to her left. 2 others became suddenly interested in their own bootlaces. The 5th man, who was broad through the shoulders with the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades listening to what wood wants to do before forcing it to do something else, made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't quite a word. Wren cataloged him. Cal Briggs, she would learn, 52 years old, 28 years of carpentry behind him, the kind of confidence in his own expertise that has never been seriously challenged and doesn't know it. The 6th man stepped forward. Emmett Voss was 54 years old and the most prosperous man within 50 miles of Harrow Flats. He owned the best farmland in the valley and a cattle operation that had weathered the previous two winters better than anyone's. And he wore both facts the way he wore his coat, as though they fit him correctly because he had earned the right to their fit. His mustache was trimmed with the precision of a man who considers presentation a form of argument. His voice had learned over decades to sound like reason, even when it was delivering judgment, and what he said to Wren Calloway on the morning of her arrival in Harrow Flats was the most dangerous kind of thing, something that sounded like concern. Young woman, the tone that men use when they've already decided the answer and are performing the question as a courtesy. The Dakota Territory has broken men twice your size who came here better prepared than you appear to be. There's a women's shelter in Yankton. A decent place. We can arrange the fare, it wouldn't be a burden to the community. Wren set her flour bag on the floor. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Voss, Emmett Voss. She had known men who spoke in this register. She had worked in their houses, cleaned their floors, laundered their shirts at $2 a week, and learned that this particular tone helpful, certain conclusive, was not a conversation. It was a door being held open for her departure. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Voss. Her voice was even. I'll be staying. From the corner near the dry goods, Harriet Crane moved forward with the precise steps of a woman who considers good posture a moral position. She wore the kind of dark dress that seemed to absorb light rather than simply block it, and her gray eyes had already arrived at their conclusion about Wren before she'd crossed half the distance between them. She spoke of a women's home in Bismarck, of arrangements that could be made of the Christian obligation to think of the child's welfare, by which she meant a specific institution in the territorial capital where babies whose mothers had made inconvenient decisions could be received by decent people. There's no shame, Harriet concluded, in recognizing the limits of one's situation. Something settled in Wren's chest. Not anger, which would have been too hot and too costly. Something older than anger. Something that had been forming in her during 11 days of walking through the Dakota spring with the letter in her bag. The thing her mother's mother had tried to put into words once, and only partly succeeded because some things resist the containers language makes for them. It was the knowledge that the person speaking to you has already written the end of your story and that you are the only one who can pick up the pen. Thank you for your concern, Wren said. I'll be staying. Cal Briggs let out a sound from his corner of the store, not quite a laugh, aimed at no one in particular. Ground out here breaks a man's back by August. What do you think it does to a girl carrying extra weight? Wren turned to look at him directly, which was not what he'd expected. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, the amount of time it takes to let someone understand that you've seen them clearly before turning back to the counter. Mabel Storch had been watching all of this. Mabel was 38 years old and had been running the mercantile alone since her husband died of fever the previous summer. She was not a warm woman in the way the word warm usually implies. She didn't offer comfort freely or smile at things that weren't worth smiling at. What she had instead was rarer in a settlement like Harrow Flats. She paid attention. When everyone else in the room had been performing their response to Wren Calloway's presence, Mabel had been watching the girl's hands, her posture, the way she'd set the flour bag down. Not with the exhaustion of someone at the end of their resources, but with the deliberateness of someone setting something aside to deal with later. What do you need? Mabel said. Land registration, whatever parcel nobody else wants. Mabel's expression didn't change. There's a section on the west slope Ridgeback Hill. Hard ground, no timber, no surface water. Nobody's touched it. Because nobody wants it, Wren said. That's correct. How much to register the claim? $13. Wren counted out the money and pushed it across the counter. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something happens that doesn't fit the script anyone prepared. Emmett Voss, who had expected tears or argument, or at minimum the gratitude of someone being rescued, found himself standing in the aftermath of a transaction that had simply proceeded without him. He left without speaking, which was not something Emmett Voss did often. That was when Mabel noticed. She noted it in the same private mental ledger where she recorded everything that seemed worth remembering, and then she reached under the counter and produced a small leather-bound notebook, which she set between herself and Wren with the deliberate care of someone placing something valuable. I'll extend you credit, Mabel said. For supplies. You'll sign for it now, and when I've figured out what I want in return, I'll come and tell you. You can settle then. Wren looked at the notebook. It could have been a trap or an opportunity. At 17 with $13 gone and a Dakota winter ahead, the only honest answer to that question was that it was probably both, and she was going to have to go through it either way. She signed. Ridgeback Hill was everything Mabel had described in a persuasive argument against human habitation. The western slope caught the full weight of whatever the territory decided to throw from the north, which in Dakota territory was considerable and personal. The soil was dense, the color of old bone, the kind of ground that looked as though the life had been pressed out of it over centuries by something that hadn't liked it. The grass grew in low, yellowed patches. There was no shade, no surface water, no natural windbreak of any kind. 3 previous homesteaders had staked claims here, built wooden structures and abandoned them after their first winter, 2 of them before spring, 1 of them in February, which in this territory was the month most likely to make a person reconsider everything they thought they knew about their own endurance. Wren spent her first 2 nights sleeping under the open sky with her flour bag as a pillow, watching the flat, black canopy above her with its extravagant scatter of stars, and thought about her grandmother. Nana Sable had been a woman of the Osage Nation who had followed her daughter's family to Kansas when Wren was an infant, had lived in a 2-room house on the western edge of Topeka for the 9 years between that arrival and her death, and had spent a considerable portion of those 9 years teaching Wren things that didn't exist in any schoolbook. Not because the knowledge wasn't real, it was more real than most of what the schoolbooks contained, but because it belonged to a tradition that the schoolbooks weren't interested in recording. Knowledge that lived in the hands and the eyes and the quality of attention one paid to the ground beneath one's feet. On the 3rd night, sitting at the base of Ridgeback Hill, with the stars doing their indifferent work overhead, Wren let herself remember one specific thing. She had been 9 years old in the kitchen of the Topeka house, and Nana Sable had been sitting across from her with her weathered hands in her lap, and her voice in the low register she used when she was about to say something important. The ground under your feet is never as cold as the air. Wren, in summer, it holds the cool. In winter, it holds the warmth. It doesn't fight the weather, it absorbs it and gives back what it keeps. Our people knew this before there was a word for architecture. If you build your house in the earth, you're not fighting the territory. You're joining something that was already there. Wren sat on the west slope of Ridgeback Hill for a long time after that memory. Then she stood up, looked at the hill in front of her, spent the rest of the night making calculations in the dirt with a stick, and at first light walked back to Mabel Storch's Mercantile to buy a pickaxe for $2.25, which she put on account. She did not tell anyone what she was planning to build. She didn't need their opinion. She needed the ground. She began on the south-facing side of the hill where the winter sun would strike the entrance directly, and the hill itself would block the north wind that everyone in Harrow Flats agreed cut through a person like something with intentions. Not digging down the way you dig a well, digging in the way an animal makes a den, the way the earth itself makes a cave, the way every underground thing that has ever survived a winter does it. The goal was a room inside the hill rather than on top of it. Let the earth be the walls instead of fighting against them, because the earth had been doing this longer than any timber merchant in Minnesota had been milling Douglas fir. The work was severe. The ground was dense and full of rocks that had to be pried loose and carried. In the first morning, she broke a blister on her right palm that reopened every day for a week before it gave up trying to be a blister and accepted its new existence as a callus. The muscles across her shoulders burned each night with a specific deep pain that was different from the walking pain, more earned somehow, as though the ground was letting her know what it cost to be taken seriously. She worked mornings when the soil was coolest, stopped during the worst heat of the afternoon, returned until dark, made the difference between earth and shadow impossible to read. The hole grew. On the 3rd day of digging, Emmett Voss rode by on a gray horse. He stopped. He watched her work for a moment with the expression of a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit any of his existing categories. "What in the name of creation are you doing?" He meant it as a challenge. It came out as a genuine question which surprised him. Wren drove her pickaxe into the ground without pausing. "Building my home, Mr. Voss." He looked at the excavation, maybe 6 feet deep at that point. Still rough, still more geological curiosity than human intention. "That's a hole in the ground. Civilized people build walls." Civilized people lost fingers to frostbite and wooden walls last winter. She looked up at him then, just for a moment. I checked the territorial land records at Mabel's before I chose my parcel. Emmett Voss had a specific relationship with being answered. He was accustomed to having the last word in conversations, not because he was particularly tyrannical about it, but because over 54 years of being the most capable and most prosperous man in every room he'd entered, the last word had simply accrued to him the way interest accrues to a well-managed account. The girl with the pickaxe had just said something that was either very stupid or very calculated, and the unsettling thing was that he couldn't immediately determine which. He spurred his horse and rode away without responding. Mabel Storch, who happened to be making a supply delivery to a farm a quarter-mile south that afternoon, had witnessed the exchange from a distance. She noted it in her private ledger. The notation was brief, but she would return to it several times in the months that followed. Cal Briggs came by on day 5 with a wagon carrying leftover lumber from a project good pine, straight-grained more than enough to frame a small structure. He set the brake and climbed down with the generous expression of a man delivering charity he considers a kindness. The lumber was genuinely good. The offer was genuinely sincere. Wren understood both these things. "I can't use it," she said, "but thank you." Cal's expression shifted through several registers' confusion, then the particular stiffness of a competent man whose competence has been politely declined. "This is quality pine. Properly framed, it'll stand for 20 years. I know, I'm building something that needs to stand for longer than that." She said it without heat or self-importance, which made it worse somehow. Cal climbed back onto his wagon with the lumber still in the bed and drove away. His son Decker, 15 years old, with his father's broad forehead and a quality of open attention that his father's certainty hadn't yet trained out of him, had ridden along and now sat on the wagon seat watching the work with an expression Wren couldn't fully read from her position in the excavation. It wasn't dismissal. It was closer to a question he didn't yet have language for. Harriet Crane came with 3 women from the church circle on the 6th day. They brought bread which was genuinely welcome and a reiteration of the Bismarck home arrangement which was not. Harriet spoke of clean names and reasonable limits and the obligations of Christian women to recognize when they had exceeded the proper bounds of independence. Wren accepted the bread with courtesy that stopped precisely at her eyes, thanked them in a voice that gave nothing away, and watched their shapes diminish across the flatland. That night she sat at the entrance to her unfinished work and let 2 tears run down her face. Then 2 more. Then she stopped performing restraint and let herself cry properly, the kind that uses the shoulders and doesn't concern itself with dignity, for about 10 minutes. She had learned from Nana Sable that grief given its proper time tends to finish, while grief that is refused tends to compound until it finds its own exit. 10 minutes later, she wiped her face with the back of her work-roughened hand, picked up the pickaxe, and went back to the ground. She had been at the work for 3 weeks when she had the only evening that seriously tested her certainty. The excavation was proceeding correctly by every calculation she'd made in the dirt. The dimensions were nearly complete: 4 meters wide, 6 meters deep, the ceiling at its apex high enough to stand upright without stooping. The south face was taking shape, oriented to catch the low winter sun. The entrance would open into the protection of the hill's own mass. Everything she was building followed the logic that Nana Sable had given her, and that she'd spent 3 days observing the hill to confirm. But that night, alone in the half-finished hole with the prairie dark pressing down from above, she sat with her back against the raw earth wall and understood for the first time that understanding something in principle and doing it alone from a standing start with $11 in credit and no one to ask were different categories of knowledge. She was not afraid of the work failing. She was afraid of a more specific thing, that she was the only person on earth who would know it had failed, because she was the only person on earth who had believed it could succeed. She sat with that for 20 minutes, not 1 minute, and then courage 20 real minutes in which she didn't move and didn't pick up any tools and genuinely didn't know. Then she did something she hadn't allowed herself since Topeka. She took the letter from her bag and read it one more time. "You are your mother's mistake. Don't come back." She folded it carefully, put it back, picked up the pickaxe, not because the 20 minutes had resolved anything they hadn't, but because the alternative to picking it up was the only worse option available, and she had not walked 11 days from Topeka to choose the worse option. The ground was still there in the morning. Silas Potts came on a Tuesday afternoon in early June alone, without the performance of a reason. He was 72 years old and had been living on the eastern edge of Harrow Flats since 1859, which made him the longest established resident of the territory and also one of the least consulted. He had lost 4 fingers to frostbite in the winter of 1868, not all at once, which would have been dramatic, but 2 in January and 2 more in February, which was worse because the first loss hadn't taught him enough about what was coming. What remained after that winter was not fear exactly, but a kind of purchased humility that he wore so constantly he'd stopped noticing it, and that made him different from almost every other man in Harrow Flats in one specific way. When he looked at something, he tried to see what was actually there before he decided what it meant. He stood at the entrance of the excavation with his hat in his hand, looked around the interior with the slow, comprehensive attention of someone who is genuinely trying to understand something, rather than confirm what they already believe. "Your mother's people, Osage," he said. Wren straightened up. "How did you know the wall work?" He gestured with his hat at the clay and grass mixture she'd been applying in layers to the excavated walls. "The way you're sealing it. Saw something similar once. 1861. A family wintered in a draw outside Sioux Falls. The father had a Lakota grandmother, had the knowledge from her. Whole family walked out in March." He paused. "Rest of us weren't entirely certain we would." He looked at the direction she'd oriented the entrance. He looked at the position of the drainage channel she'd cut along the south face. He replaced his hat. "You have enough food for the season." She answered honestly, because Silas Potts was one of about 3 people she'd encountered in Harrow Flats who asked a direct question because he wanted a direct answer rather than a confirmation of something he'd already decided. She told him what she had and what she still needed. He nodded once, turned, walked back down the hill without offering anything. 3 mornings later, a steel rabbit snare appeared on the ground in front of the entrance. No note, no name. The quality of it was professional, the kind of trap that takes experience to set correctly, the kind that works reliably in the terrain between Ridgeback Hill and Coulter Creek, if you knew where animals moved. She stood looking at it for a long moment. The rabbit was the gift, the snare was the real message. Here is a tool that will work if you learn to use it correctly, and I believe you are the kind of person who will learn to use it correctly. Nobody in Harrow Flats had treated Wren Calloway as a capable person before that morning. The distinction between being helped and being credited was not small. She set the snare that evening in the narrow passage between 2 flat rocks where the track evidence told her rabbits moved at dusk. The next morning it held a rabbit which she cleaned with her knife in the way Nana Sable had shown her, and she ate well for the first time since arriving on the hill. Silas Potts never mentioned the snare to anyone. That was also part of the message. The excavation took 4 weeks total. After it came the finish work, which was different in character, less about raw physical effort and more about precision and patience. The specific attention required to make something function rather than simply exist. She sealed the walls in layers clay dug from the lower slope, mixed with cut sections of prairie grass, applied wet and allowed to dry between coats, each layer slightly adjusted for consistency based on what the previous layer had taught her. When it dried correctly, the surface was hard and smooth and would not dissolve when moisture found it. She worked by touch as much as by sight, learning the wall through her hands, the way you learn a skill, not through understanding it, but through doing it until the difference between right and almost right registered in the fingertips before the mind had caught up. She dragged roof timbers from a dry section of the Coulter Creek bed 3 miles away, one at a time over 2 days each trip, consuming most of a morning. She laid them across the excavated space with an overhang on the south side to deflect rain. She layered dried brush over the timbers, then stretched her single waterproof tarpaulin over the brush, then piled 60 centimeters of prairie soil over everything living soil, with the grass roots still in it, which meant that within weeks the roof would knit itself into the hillside around it and become indistinguishable from the rest of Ridgeback Hill. From the blacksmith, she bought an old iron barrel for $2 and had him weld its 2 worst holes for 30 cents. This became her stove, centered in the room with a metal flue pipe rising up through the roof and sealed at every joint with packed clay. Before she placed the barrel, she dug a pit beneath its intended position and filled it with flat stones, hauled from Coulter Creek stones, that would absorb heat over hours and release it slowly through the night, maintaining temperature long after the fire itself had gone to coals. The floor she paved with the same flat creek stones set slightly lower than the entrance threshold, so that cold air, being heavier than warm, would pool at floor level, while breathable warmth rose to the height of a living body. The door she built from salvaged shipping crate wood, purchased for $1 from Mabel. Not beautiful, but functional, and critically, it opened inward. Wind pressure would seal it tighter rather than tearing it from its frame. The two windows were openings the size of a large Bible set in the south face and covered with oiled paper stretched over frames they admitted diffuse light without admitting the wind. She counted the total at the margins of Nana Sable's Bible when it was done $14.60. She had 20 cents remaining, 3 potatoes, half a bag of flour, and a tin of lard. Mabel Storch came to Ridgeback Hill on a Thursday afternoon in late July, arriving in the unhurried way of someone who has decided on a thing and is not concerned about the timing. She had closed the mercantile early the first time since her husband's funeral, and she carried the leather notebook with Wren's signature on its first page. She descended the entrance step and stood in the interior of the finished dwelling. The room held a steady warmth that bore no obvious relationship to any fire currently burning, because there was no fire. The walls were smooth and slightly cool to the touch, the way earth is at depth, and they held the temperature of the season the way a river holds water, not because anyone asked it to, but because that is simply what the depth does. Mabel stood in the center of the room for a long moment. Whatever she had been prepared to conclude about this structure had been arrived at before she descended the step, and what she found when she got inside was not what she'd concluded. She sat down. "I know what I want," Mabel said. Wren waited. The knowledge Wren carried, the earth-building techniques, the thermal principles, the construction sequence was going to be needed. Come spring, new families would arrive in the Dakota Territory from Ohio and Illinois and Minnesota with homestead claims and no capital. They would need to survive their first winter. Mabel sold materials. She intended to sell knowledge alongside materials with Wren's methods documented and available. "I want to sell what you know," Mabel said, paired with the materials needed to apply it. "Both of us receive a portion of each transaction." Wren took the notebook from Mabel's hand, turned to a clean page, and wrote her own conditions in the careful handwriting of someone who had taught herself from a Bible. The conditions were specific, a percentage she named credit attached to her name in every transaction, the right to refuse any case she judged unsuitable. She handed the notebook back. Mabel read it. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile more, the expression of someone who has confirmed a working hypothesis. She signed. It was the first negotiation Wren had entered in Harrow Flats, where she was not the party with less power, and she felt the difference in her chest, a small specific shift, like a stone that has been sitting at an angle for months, finally settling onto its flat side. Emmett Voss and Reverend Thaddeus Crane came together on a morning in August, arriving with the particular posture of men who have decided that what they are doing is for someone else's benefit. The Reverend was lean mid-50s with a voice trained for Sunday mornings and a permanent expression of sorrow for the condition of the world. He carried his Bible not as an afterthought, but as a tool, the way a craftsman carries the instrument his work most depends on. Emmett carried his authority the same way, not visibly, because he didn't need to. Emmett spoke first in the register he reserved for final statements. There was a county court in the territorial capital that handled matters of child welfare. He was not threatening, he wanted to be clear. He was trying to spare her the embarrassment of having it come to that. Reverend Crane opened his Bible to a passage about the community's obligation to protect the vulnerable. Wren's voice stayed level without heat, because heat would have let them dismiss her. "Quote me the chapter and verse where it says, 'A community may remove a living child from its mother because she is poor.'" The Reverend's mouth opened and then closed. "I know that book," she continued. "My grandmother read it to me every night for 9 years. I know which passages are in it and which ones people claim are in it when they want to do something they've already decided to do." Emmett took a step forward. His voice dropped to the register that constituted his final offer, the tone of a man who has run out of patience for performances and is now simply stating facts. He had the means to pursue this through proper channels if she would not go voluntarily. Wren held his eyes. The thing that had been forming in her chest since Topeka, since the letter, since the road, since the first morning on this hill with a pickaxe, and 20 minutes in which she hadn't known was fully formed now, dense as riverstone. "You are welcome to try, Mr. Voss. I will be here when you come back." The two men stood in the face of that and found it harder than they'd expected. Emmett Voss had built most of what he owned on the force of his certainty, and there was something in the encounter with equivalent certainty in a 17-year-old girl with clay on her hands that didn't move when he pushed against it, something that didn't fit his categories that would require him to add a new one, rather than simply correct an existing error. They left. Wren watched them go. When they were far enough that they couldn't have seen her, even if they'd looked back, she sat down against the south face of the hill and cried. Not the controlled 2 tears she'd allowed herself before. Not the 10-minute version, but something longer and less organized, the kind that doesn't ask permission. She let it run for as long as it needed to. When it finished, she sat in the quiet for a moment and noticed that the hill behind her was still exactly where it had been. She wiped her face with her sleeve, stood up, went back inside to finish sealing the last section of the north wall. The dwelling was complete in the first week of September 1882, when the cottonwoods along Coulter Creek were trembling yellow at their edges, and the evenings had begun to carry the specific edge that experienced settlers recognized as the territory shifting its intentions toward winter. Wren stood before the reclaimed wood door and looked at the grass-covered mound that was her roof, indistinguishable from the hillside around it, and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not pride, which was too external, too concerned with what could be seen. Something more internal, more specific, the particular satisfaction of having done an exact thing correctly. The feeling of a problem solved rather than a performance given. That night she slept for the first time under her own roof on a straw mattress she'd made herself from sewn flour sacks. The silence inside the dwelling was different from the silence of the open prairie. It was enclosed, held the silence of a space that contained you, rather than exposing you to the full indifference of the sky. No wind reached her. No wood contracted against cold. Only the occasional small sound of a mouse in its corner, and her own breathing, and the child not yet born, not yet named, but present in the specific way that presences make themselves known from the inside. She lay in the dark with her hand on her stomach and thought about a particular evening 9 years ago in Topeka. Nana Sable's hand flat on the earth outside the back door of the house, on the edge of the city, her voice quiet as stone. The earth doesn't ask you to earn your place in it. It already made room for you before you arrived. All you have to do is accept the room. Down in the valley, Emmett Voss's house went dark, one lamp at a time. In the Mercantile, a leather notebook sat under the counter with a girl's signature on its first page. On the eastern edge of the flats, Silas Potts was watching a beaver dam on Coulter Creek that was already in September building higher than he'd seen it in 20 years of observation, and the expression on his face as he watched it was the expression of a man receiving information he'd been hoping not to receive. The night was clear. The stars above Ridgeback Hill were the kind that looked like they'd been scattered by something that wasn't concerned with pattern-only abundance. Inside the hill, the temperature held. The walls held. The ground held everything it had ever been asked to hold, which was considerable, and didn't mention it. Wren Calloway slept. October arrived in the Dakota Territory the way it always did, with beauty calibrated to make a person forget what was coming. The days ran gold and unhurried, the light falling at an angle that made even the hardest ground look generous, and it was possible to walk through those afternoons believing the world intended to stay like this. The settlers who had been here long enough knew better. They had learned to read October the way a careful man reads a contract, looking past the pleasant surface language for the clause that changes everything. Emmett Voss was adding a covered walkway between his house and the new stable he'd completed in late summer. The stable had cost him $340 and represented the finest outbuilding within 60 miles of Harrow Flats, framed with seasoned lumber, roofed with double-layered boards packed with straw insulation, fitted with real glass in the ventilation windows. He had designed it himself with the confidence of a man whose previous constructions had all performed as intended, which meant the confidence of a man who had not yet built something that failed under the specific conditions this particular winter was preparing to provide. Cal Briggs was finishing the new room on the north side of his house, the one he'd been planning since spring. The stove he'd ordered from a supplier in St. Paul had arrived in September, a handsome piece of ironwork enameled dark green with a firebox designed for sustained burning, and a flue system the supplier's catalog described as engineered for optimal draft in high-wind environments. Cal had installed it himself over 2 days with the methodical confidence of a man who has spent 28 years making materials do what he wanted them to do. The flue ran straight up through the new room's ceiling and out the north-facing roof pitch. He had not noticed, could not have noticed, without a winter-sustained north wind, to reveal it that the geometry of the roofline created a pressure differential that would push combustion gases back down the flue rather than drawing them out. The catalog had not mentioned this possibility. The supplier was in Minnesota. Rowena Briggs had developed a cough in late September that she described to anyone who asked as nothing serious. It had the quality of something positioning itself for a longer stay. Decker Briggs had stopped pretending he needed a reason to go up Ridgeback Hill. He showed up on a Wednesday afternoon in early October with no explanation offered, stood at the entrance to the dwelling and waited until Wren stepped aside. Inside, he moved around the perimeter of the room, slowly touching nothing, his eyes doing the work his hands wanted to do. The temperature differential between the outside air and the room's interior was already noticeable. Not dramatic, not the aggressive warmth of a stoked fire, but something steadier and more fundamental, like the difference between a lamp and the sun. "It's already warm in here," Decker said. "Outside's been cold since last week." The earth stores what the season gives it. Wren was sorting dried herbs into clay pots, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste motion. Summer's heat is still in the ground at this depth. It doesn't know yet that the surface has changed its mind. He looked at the organized provisions, the hanging dried meat, the clay pots of flour and grain and salt arranged by frequency of use. The fuel supply stacked in the alcove she'd cut into the west wall, specifically to keep it dry without requiring the main door to open. He was doing arithmetic, she could see it in his face. The arithmetic of someone comparing what this looked like from the outside with what it actually was on the inside, which was a complete system rather than an improvisation. "How long will your stores last? April if I'm careful, March if the winter runs hard." He stood with that for a moment. Then, "My father is building a new room. He's proud of the fireplace." Wren said nothing, which was its own kind of response. Decker heard it anyway. He came back Thursday. He came back the following Monday. Each time he watched her work, the way she managed the barrel stove's draw, the way she checked the wall seals by pressing her palm flat against each section in sequence, the way she moved through her own space with the unhurried economy of someone who has internalized every dimension of where she lives. He didn't ask many questions. He was the kind of person who learns by watching first, then asking what watching doesn't answer, which is rarer at 15 than it sounds. On his fourth visit, Cal caught him coming through the door at home. Cal had been in the kitchen when Decker arrived, and the single second of hesitation before Decker answered the question of where he'd been was 1 second too many. Cal's face went through something complicated. He struck his son once across the face, not a beating, not violence that leaves lasting marks, but the kind that is meant to draw a line. Decker absorbed it without sound and went to his room. Cal stood in the kitchen with his hand still raised to approximately chest height, the way a man's arm stays after a gesture whose purpose has already been spent. He hadn't planned to do that. He also wasn't certain he'd been wrong to. Decker had said before the blow, "She knows things you don't know about building for Winter Father. I'm not saying that to disrespect you. I'm saying it because it's true and I thought you'd want to know." 28 years. Cal had built everything from grain bins to churches in this territory, and he had built them well, and the evidence of that quality stood in a dozen structures across the Harrow Flats Valley. His son was 15 and had spent 4 afternoons watching a girl who had arrived with a canvas bag and dug a hole. Cal lowered his hand. He stood at the kitchen window, looking in the direction of Ridgeback Hill, not seeing it through the distance, but knowing where it was. He didn't go up the hill. He wasn't ready for what going up the hill would require him to admit. Dorinda Voss came on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October alone, without telling Emmett where she was going. She was 48 years old, had been married to Emmett Voss for 26 years, had lost a child in the winter of 1874. A boy of 2, their second son Thomas, in a house that was smaller than what they had now, but not so small that it should have failed them. Emmett had built a larger house the following spring. Then a larger one still. The house they lived in now was the 4th version, each iteration a specific response to the one that had preceded it, each one better insulated, better framed, better equipped with the things that wood and glass construction could provide. She had never told Emmett that the problem she felt in those houses was not one that more lumber could solve. She descended the entrance step, and her whole body changed. The tension she'd been holding against the expected cold dissolved into something she hadn't encountered in a house before. A warmth that wasn't asking anything of her, that had no fire to tend or fuel to add, that simply existed in the ground around her, the way groundwater exists below the surface, not because someone put it there, but because this is what the depth is. "My lord," she said quietly. They sat. The silence between them had the quality that sometimes develops between women who recognize something in each other before they have language for what they're recognizing. I lost a child in the winter of '74. Dorinda's voice held the evenness of someone who has lived with a thing long enough that it no longer requires ceremony to be spoken. He was two. Thomas. The house we had then, Emmett built a bigger one come spring. Then another. Every winter a bigger house, better materials, more firewood stacked. She looked at her hands. None of them have ever felt like this. Wren didn't rush the silence that followed. She had learned that some things needed their full space or they compressed into something smaller than what they actually were. How did you know it would work? Dorinda asked. I didn't know. I trusted what my grandmother told me, watched how the hill handled the fall, did the work. A beat. Knowing and trusting are different kinds of certainty. Knowing is faster. Trusting is harder to break. Dorinda nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone filing something away in a place she intends to return to. Before she stood to leave, she said, "When it's time, don't be alone. There may be more choices than you think." She offered no elaboration. She climbed the entrance step and walked back down toward the valley without looking back. That night in the big house at the valley center, after their sons were asleep, Emmett sat with Dorinda at the kitchen table in the diminished light of a single lamp. It was Dorinda who spoke first. "Do you ever think about Thomas?" Emmett was still for a moment. Thomas was not a name they said often. The not saying of it had become so habitual over 9 years that the name now carried the weight of its own absence. "Yes. Every house you've built since then, I've known what you were building it for." Her voice had the quality of someone setting down a fact they've been carrying at an angle for too long. A house that couldn't happen again. Emmett looked at the lamp. The flame did its small, indifferent work. "That's why you can't look at what she built, Emmett. Not really look. It works for a reason. You've been trying to solve a different way for 9 years. And if you look at it long enough, you'll have to reckon with the fact that you've been solving for the wrong thing." The kitchen held that between them. Emmett didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that fit what she'd said without requiring him to move into territory he wasn't prepared to enter yet. He sat with it the way you sit with something that's true before you've decided what to do about its being true. Eventually, he added a log to the stove that didn't strictly need one and went to bed. November settled in with the personality of a landlord who has stopped being polite about the rent. The wind came down off the open prairie with a consistency that stopped being weather and became simply the condition of the world, a sustained pressure against every north-facing surface in Harrow Flats that tested joints, found gaps, and made its findings known to the people living behind those joints at 2 in the morning when the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. Wren's fuel supply was working exactly as calculated. The stones beneath the barrel stove held heat for 6 to 8 hours after the fire went to coals, which meant she could bank the fire at 10 in the evening and the room would still be above 50 degrees at 6 in the morning. She was using approximately 1/3 of the fuel a wooden structure of comparable size would have required, which meant her April estimate was not optimism, but arithmetic. She was still gathering in the mornings, moving across the hillside with a cloth sack, reading the ground for what it was still offering before the freeze locked everything down. Dried roots to supplement the grain stores. Prairie grass bundled for additional fuel. The rabbit snare had become reliable enough that she ate meat 3 times a week, which was more consistent protein than most of the wooden houses in the valley below were managing by November. On a night in the middle of November, she woke at 2 in the morning with pain, not gradual, present, immediately fully formed in her abdomen. She lay still in the darkness of the dwelling and waited. The fire had gone to coals hours ago, and the stones were doing their work. The room was holding somewhere around 52 degrees. She was alone in a way that had no qualifications attached to it, no neighbor close enough to reach in darkness, no sound from the valley below, nothing between her and whatever was happening except her own stillness. The pain came in a wave, then receded, then came again. She counted breaths, 1 through 15. Then again. She thought about Dorinda's words with a specific quality of attention: don't be alone. There may be more choices, and understood, in the 2 in the morning clarity that comes with fear, that she had no way to act on those words before daylight, and daylight was 4 hours away, and the snow that had started falling when she'd banked the fire was making the hillside a different problem than the problem inside. 40 minutes. She counted through 40 minutes of this. Then the pain stopped, cleanly, with the abruptness of something switched off rather than something fading. her body rehearsing, preparing, doing what bodies do in the months before birth without concerning themselves with the timing preferences of the person they belong to. She lay with her hand on her stomach for another 5 minutes. The wind outside pressed its case against the hill, and the hill declined to respond. She got up, added a small handful of fuel to the barrel, checked the wall seals by feel in the darkness, the way she checked them every night, her hands reading the clay surface for any change in temperature that would indicate a breach. Nothing had changed. She went back to the mattress. Nobody in Harrow Flats knew this had happened. Only the record of it exists, and the specific weight of being alone in the dark with that particular species of fear is not something that transfers cleanly through description. It is something that most people know from their own lives, in their own darknesses, regardless of what century they lived in or what territory they called home. She slept. The first serious snow came in late November, and the character of Harrow Flats changed. Mabel Storch noticed it from behind the mercantile counter in the way she noticed most things by watching patterns rather than individual instances. 3 men came in that week for more lamp oil than they should have needed. Conversation in the store took on a different quality, less about neighbors' business, more about the specific observable facts of the season, the depth of ice forming on Coulter Creek, the behavior of cattle in the south pasture, whether what old Silas Potts had said about the beaver dam in September meant what he'd implied it meant. Silas Potts had not been to town in 3 weeks. He had said what he had to say and gone home to finish his preparations with the thoroughness of a man who understood that what was coming was not interested in excuses. The beaver dam on Coulter Creek was by the first week of December the tallest Silas had seen in 40 years of watching it. Animals that build for winter do not build according to the calendar or to any human theory about what a normal winter looks like. They build according to what they can feel coming through the ground and the air and the water information, moving at frequencies that most human beings had stopped listening for around the time they started putting walls between themselves and the world. Silas had lost 4 fingers to frostbite in 1868. He had been listening for those frequencies ever since. In the mercantile, Mabel opened her private ledger one afternoon and wrote a single line without date or name, the kind of notation a person makes when they want evidence that they noticed something before everyone else admitted it was worth noticing. Emmett Voss's house was consuming firewood faster than in any previous winter. He had ordered what he'd considered a generous supply in September. He was revising the definition of generous. The new Briggs room was creating problems Cal couldn't trace to their source. Rowena's cough had deepened as November turned to December, settling into her chest with the patience of something that has found a good location. The new room, despite the expensive St. Paul stove, ran 5 degrees colder than the rest of the house in sustained north winds. Cal had spent 2 weeks checking every joint he could reach, resealing window frames, adding weather stripping to the door. The room still ran cold. He had not yet traced the problem to the flue geometry, because that flaw only revealed itself under conditions of a sustained north wind above a certain velocity, and November's winds had been strong, but not sustained enough to demonstrate it fully. The full demonstration was coming. The evening of January 22nd, 1883, Wren came outside to bring in her last load of fuel before dark. She set down the carrying basket and straightened up and heard a sound that was not a sound. The specific absence of something that had been present for 3 months without interruption. The wind had stopped, not diminished, not shifted direction, stopped. She stood in that silence and understood it immediately, the way you understand a certain quality of stillness in a room where something has just happened that cannot be undone. The wind in Dakota Territory in winter was not intermittent. It was the background of everything, the medium through which the season expressed itself. Its absence was not peace. It was the pause before a very large sound, the held breath of something that was gathering rather than resting. She looked at the sky. The northwestern horizon had gone the color of old bone yellowish, without depth, carrying no suggestion that there was anything behind it, except more of itself extending to wherever the atmosphere ended. The birds that had remained through December were gone, not relocated to a different field, not settled into the tree line along Coulter Creek. Absent. The kind of gone that means the information was unambiguous. She went inside. She added fuel more than her evening amount, significantly more, the amount appropriate for a fire she intended to sustain rather than bank. She checked every wall joint by pressing her palm in sequence against each section of the sealed surface. She checked the flue seal. The door fit the position of the water she kept stored in sealed clay vessels away from any wall that might transmit freezing temperatures. She inventoried the fuel alcove. She inventoried the food. She had done everything she knew how to do. The room was warm. The stones were charged. The walls were sound. The stores were full. She sat on her wooden stool with her hand on her stomach, where the child moved in the slow, deliberate way of someone doing a thing for reasons of their own. Outside, the sky continued its color change, slow, certain the way all large things move when they have already decided what they're going to do. The morning of January 23rd, 1883, began with a stillness so absolute that Harrow Flats felt suspended in something other than air. Wren was already awake before 4. Something in the quality of the silence had pulled her up from sleep, the way a sudden sound would have, because the absence of something that has always been present can be louder than any noise. She had her fuel loaded and her water verified and her door checked before the first ice needles came in sideways off the open prairie. That was what arrived first, not snowflakes, but ice crystals, driven horizontal by a wind that had apparently been conserving itself for precisely this moment. It arrived not in gusts, but as a sustained force uniform, an unyielding pressing against every exposed surface in the Dakota Territory, simultaneously and holding. Within an hour, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. By noon, it had dropped 25 more. Inside the dwelling on Ridgeback Hill, the barrel stove ticked quietly. The floor stones were warm under their flat surfaces. The temperature held. Outside, the world had become a single, undifferentiated roar of white. In the Voss house, the 3 fireplaces were running at full capacity before noon. Doyle and his younger brothers were rotating through the house on 2-hour cycles, feeding fuel to all 3, keeping the wood moving from the stack along the exterior wall to the interior boxes. By mid-afternoon, Emmett did the calculation. He'd been avoiding the one that compared what remained in the woodpile against what the night would require, then what tomorrow would require, then the night after that. The number he arrived at was not the number he needed. He added a log that wasn't in the plan, sent his family to bed, sat alone by the kitchen stove, and said nothing to anyone. In the Briggs house, the new room demonstrated its flaw definitively. The sustained north wind created exactly the pressure differential the flue geometry had been waiting to reveal. Combustion gases pushed back down the stack, smoke filling the room faster than the stove could warm it. Cal sealed the new room entirely and moved everyone into the main house. Rowena's cough in the cold air that moved through gaps Cal had sealed twice and kept finding again deepened past the point where it sounded temporary. It sounded like something making itself permanent. Decker sat in the main room and listened to his mother and listened to his father move through the house with the sounds of a capable man encountering the precise edge of his capability. And he understood something that 15-year-olds sometimes achieve precisely because they haven't yet learned to protect themselves from understanding. There was a place not far from where he was sitting that was warm and built correctly for exactly this, and he did not say it aloud because he knew what saying it would cost, and because his father was not yet in the place where he could hear it. In the Crane house, the choice between cold and smoke had resolved itself by evening in favor of cold, which was the wrong resolution for a 9-year-old in a house where the interior temperature was dropping 2 degrees an hour. Harriet Crane wrapped her daughter Abigail in every available cloth. The toes of Abigail's right foot went white, then mottled purple. Harriet held them against her own stomach under her dress and counted the hours until a break she had no reason to expect. The first night passed. On the morning of January 24th, the storm did not moderate. Emmett Voss stood at his bedroom window before dawn, scraped his thumbnail across the frost on the inside of the glass, put his eye to the cleared circle, visibility perhaps 30 feet. He shifted his angle upward toward Ridgeback Hill. The smoke rose thin as a pencil line from the hillside straight up from the ground straight, because it came from a source protected enough that even in this storm, the draft at the exit point was clean. 30 feet up, the wind took it sideways, but at the source it rose straight, and it had been there all night, and it would be there when his woodpile ran out. He called his son's name. Doyle came to the window. 24 years old, same height as his father now, with the broad shoulders that came from the Voss side and the patience that came from somewhere else. He looked where Emmett pointed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The smoke thread was impossibly calm against the violence of everything surrounding it. "I was wrong." Emmett said it the way a man says something he has been building toward for months without knowing that was what he was doing. flat compressed with the specific quality of words that have been held under pressure too long and finally found their exit. About the girl, about what she built. I looked at it and saw what I expected to see instead of what was there. Doyle had grown up watching his father be certain about everything, which from the outside looks identical to being right up until the moment it doesn't. He had no frame for what he was hearing. He stored it with the careful attention of someone who recognizes that certain things heard once rearrange the way you see everything that came before them. What do we do? Emmett turned from the window. His voice had recovered its steadiness, though what was underneath it had changed. We wait for any break at all. Then we go up that hill. The break came at first light on January 25th, a narrow window between the storm's first phase and its more sustained second phase. The wind dropped from its sustained roar to something merely severe. Visibility opened to perhaps 40 feet. It was enough. In the Briggs house, Cal had been awake since 3 with Rowena. Her fever had arrived sometime in the night, low persistent, announcing a different problem than the one he'd been managing. He understood that warmth was no longer a comfort for her. It was a clinical requirement. He wrapped her in everything they had. He did not wake Decker. He lifted his wife and walked out into the lull. He went alone because there are certain admissions a man makes more honestly without witnesses, and what Cal Briggs was about to do was the largest admission of his professional life. He reached the entrance to the Ridgeback Hill dwelling, knocked, waited in the diminished storm with his wife in his arms, his face carrying the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not plan to arrive and cannot afford the time to reconcile himself to being here. He did not preamble it. He looked at Wren standing in the open doorway and said the only thing that was true, "I have nowhere else to bring her." Wren looked at Rowena, her color, her breathing, the way she held herself even in her husband's arms. She stepped back and held the door. Put her close to the barrel, east side. Cal carried Rowena in and set her down with the deliberateness of someone handling what they're afraid of losing. He stood upright in the center of the room. Then he placed his hand flat against the sealed earthen wall and stood there. He did not look at the wall. He felt it pressing his palm against the clay surface the way a craftsman feels a joint for true not reading it with his eyes, but with the accumulated sensitivity of hands that have spent 28 years learning what materials want to tell them. The wall's temperature was steady, held from within, not heated from without. The earth was doing what earth does at depth, which is simply existing at a temperature that has nothing to do with what the air outside is currently deciding. His hand stayed on that wall for a long time. His face held the expression of a man having a conversation with a fact he had declined to acknowledge until the fact declined to be declined any longer. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Wren put water on to heat. They began arriving in the next 2 hours, drawn by the same arithmetic. Cal had performed the arithmetic of survival, overriding the arithmetic of pride. The Voss family came together, Emmett first, then Dorinda, then Doyle, then the 2 younger boys. Emmett stopped in front of Wren with the space between them full of everything said since May. He stood in that space for a moment before he crossed it. "My boys are cold. We have no more wood." Dorinda stood behind him. When Wren met her eyes, Dorinda gave the smallest possible nod, the nod of someone who has been quietly holding a possibility open since October and is watching it finally come through. "Come in," Wren said. The Cranes arrived 10 minutes later. Reverend Thaddeus carrying Abigail, whose face had the flushed, papery look of a child whose body has been managing a problem for too long. Harriet walked in behind him and descended the entrance step without speaking, without any of the framework of scripture or social obligations she had placed around every previous interaction with Wren. She sat down on the floor next to the barrel and took her daughter's wrapped feet between her own hands and held them there. Mabel Storch came last, pushing through the leading edge of the storm's second phase, which had begun to build again. She arrived with a cloth bag of hardtack, set it down without ceremony. Then she sat in front of Wren and placed the leather notebook on the floor between them. She opened it to the first page. She turned each subsequent page slowly, the complete accounting of 6 months of credit, every item, every date, every amount. Then she began tearing the pages out one by one and dropping them into the barrel stove. Each page took approximately 4 seconds to become heat. Dead as clear, Wren's chest tightened with the unexpectedness of it. That wasn't the arrangement. Mabel looked up with the direct, assessing quality that had characterized every exchange between them. No, the arrangement was business. She looked around the room, 16 people alive in a space built for one alive, because of knowledge handed down through the female line of one family and carried 11 days on foot and applied alone on a hard hill. This is something else. A pause held between them. Then Wren nodded. 16 people in a space built for one. Nobody mentioned the crowding. The room held 16 people through the second night of the storm in the specific way that lifeboats hold survivors, not comfortably, not by design, but because the alternative has been made concrete enough that nobody raises the question of comfort. Wren managed the space the way she managed everything she'd built here, by reading what was actually needed rather than what was expected. The children went nearest the barrel stove arranged on the floor stones with whatever cloth could be spared. Rowena Briggs occupied the position of best sustained warmth, her back against the east wall where the thermal mass was deepest. The men arranged themselves around the perimeter. The women settled in the middle ground between the stove's direct heat and the wall's steady release. Wren moved through all of it with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose preparation had been so thorough that the crisis when it finally arrived felt less like an emergency than like a proof. She heated water in her single pot and passed tea in her single cup, refilled continuously. She warmed flat creek stones in the barrel, wrapped them in cloth, distributed them beginning with Rowena and Abigail Crane and working outward by need. Abigail's right foot was the priority. The toes had been white when they arrived, mottled purple in the cold, and now with warmth returning to them, they had entered the painful phase which Harriet was managing by holding her daughter against her chest and absorbing the child's sounds without flinching. The color was coming back. That was what mattered. Wren did not say, "I told you." She did not arrange her actions in a way that required acknowledgement of her rightness. The knowledge that she had been right was not the point of the evening. Keeping 16 people alive through a Dakota Territory blizzard at 39 below zero was the point, and those were different projects with different requirements. Outside, the storm pressed its second phase against the hillside with the patience of something that has no schedule. Inside, the earth held. The argument happened on the second evening after the children had been settled, and the adults had moved into the particular exhaustion that sets in after sustained fear, the kind that doesn't permit sleep but removes the energy required for careful behavior. Emmett Voss and Reverend Thaddeus Crane had been occupying opposite corners of the room for 36 hours without significant interaction, which was approximately the limit of what the geometry of the space permitted. The specific content of the argument was not important. It concerned the position of one of the younger Voss boys relative to the Crane family's portion of the floor space, a territorial dispute so minor that in any other context, it would not have generated audible disagreement between two adult men. What it actually concerned was the pressure of 2 days of cold and fear, and the deeply uncomfortable experience of being wrong about something that had mattered, compressed into a space where neither man had any of the usual mechanisms for managing that pressure. No authority to invoke, no exit available, no version of the room in which either of them was the one the room organized itself around. Decker Briggs was sitting approximately 4 feet from where the argument occurred. He was 15 years old, and he watched the two men with the particular clarity available to young people who haven't yet learned to protect their understanding from what it shows them. His expression didn't shift toward judgment or contempt. What it held was something more patient than either the look of someone who has already formed a picture of the kind of man he doesn't intend to become, and is watching that picture get confirmed in real time. Emmett saw the boy's face. He stopped in the middle of a sentence. He looked at Decker at the quality of attention the boy was paying, at what that quality of attention cost, and what it meant that a 15-year-old was paying it at this specific moment. Something moved through Emmett's expression, not shame, which is too self-focused, but something more outward-facing. The recognition that being witnessed by someone who is still deciding what kind of man to be carries a particular weight that being witnessed by another adult does not. He sat down. "I apologize, Reverend." Flat, genuine, without the defensive architecture that men typically build around apologies to make them feel smaller. "That wasn't necessary." Reverend Crane looked at Emmett, then at the floor. The moment required its space. "No," Crane said at last. "It wasn't." Wren had not looked up from what she'd been doing, which was rewrapping the warm stones for redistribution. She said, without directing it at anyone in particular, "Doyle, would you help me move the fuel from the outer alcove to the interior shelf? The door seal holds better if we don't open it more than once tonight." Doyle Voss stood up immediately. The physical work gave the room somewhere to put its attention, That wasn't the two men sitting in the aftermath of what they'd just done. The moment passed into the past where it belonged. Later, when the fire had gone to coals and the stones were doing their sustained work, when most of the room had found the shallow sleep that extreme fatigue eventually forces. Regardless of circumstances, Decker came to sit near Wren. The lamp was low. The temperature outside was pressing its maximum weight against the hill's exterior. "Why did you let us in?" He wasn't challenging her. The question was genuine, the kind that a person asks because they need to understand something about the world that the world hasn't adequately explained yet. Wren considered it with the seriousness it deserved, because turning someone away from warmth when you have it is a choice you carry for the rest of your life. Not as guilt as shape. It changes the shape of who you are. She looked at the coals in the barrel. "My grandmother taught me that the earth doesn't ask whether you deserve to come in. It made room before you arrived. All you have to do is accept the room and extend it when you can." Decker was quiet for a time. "My father put his hand on your wall today. He stood there a long time." "I know. I don't think he knew he was doing it." "Sometimes that's when a person learns the most important things," Wren said. "When they've stopped meaning to. When the argument they've been having with the evidence finally runs out of arguments." Decker reached out and pressed his own palm flat against the earthen wall beside him. The wall was warm, not hot, not the aggressive warmth of something burning, but the deep, patient warmth of something that has been here since before the question of warmth was a human concern. He held his hand there. Wren watched him and thought about Nana Sable and about the specific way knowledge moves through time. Not in books, not in institutions, but in hands pressed against walls, in the quality of attention a person brings to a thing they're trying to understand through their body rather than their mind. The storm ended on the morning of January 26. It didn't fade. It stopped, exhaled its final breath sometime before dawn, and left behind a silence so complete that the people inside the dwelling woke to it simultaneously, the way people wake to a sound because the cessation of 60 hours of sustained roar registered in the sleeping body as an event. Eyes opened across the room. The quality of the air had changed. Wren opened the door. The world outside was white from one horizon to the other, the specific white of a landscape remade overnight. Not the dingy, worked-over white of a storm in progress, but the clean, luminous white of aftermath reflecting the early sun in a way that made the eyes contract. The sky above was a blue so saturated it looked applied rather than natural, the blue that appears after extreme events, as though the atmosphere is compensating for what it just did. The temperature outside was still 20 below zero, but windless cold at 20 below is a different animal than 39 below in a sustained gale. Every person who came through the doorway understood the difference in their body before their mind had processed it. They gathered on the hillside in a loose group, squinting in the brightness, and looked down at Harrow Flats. The Voss stable $340 season lumber double-layered roof had lost its midsection entirely. The roof peak had collapsed inward. The side walls had blown out at their bases where the wind load had found the weakest point in the frame connection. Dark shapes in the snow around it told a story that Emmett did not walk over to read more closely. He stood on the hillside looking at it from a distance he did not close. He did not speak. His face held the expression of a man who is not surprised but has not yet arrived at what comes after not being surprised. The Briggs house stood, but the new room's roof had a visible sag at its eastern corner, where the rafter connection had failed under sustained load. The north-facing window had been pushed inward by ice expansion, leaving a rectangular opening that had been admitting outside air for an unknown number of hours. The expensive stove from St. Paul was still in there, perfect in a room that had failed around it. The Crane house had lost its front porch entirely, the posts sheared at their bases, the decking scattered into the snow along with a section of the main roof above the parlor. The chimney that had given them the choice between cold and smoke had a visible crack in its exterior stonework, running diagonally from the third course above the roof line to somewhere below the eave. Wren turned and looked at what was behind her. The snow had drifted up against the south face of Ridgeback Hill and covered the entrance overhang entirely. The roof's 60 centimeters of living prairie soil, with its grass roots still working, had been compressed by the accumulated snow into something denser than it had been, more integrated with the hillside around it. The vent pipe rose from what appeared to be unbroken earth. There was no structural evidence of the past 60 hours. No cracking, no displacement, No collapse anywhere in the visible surface. The hill had absorbed what the storm delivered the way the ground absorbs everything, completely without record, without drama, without any interest in being acknowledged for the effort. They left in stages as the morning warmed toward merely cold. The Voss family, first the boys needing to assess what could be recovered from the stable before temperatures dropped again. The Cranes next, Reverend Thaddeus carrying Abigail, whose color had returned overnight, whose foot would bruise but not lose the toes. Mabel characteristically had already been gone for 20 minutes before anyone noticed her absence. She had not waited to be thanked. Cal Briggs was last among the men. He had stayed to ensure Rowena could walk steadily before asking her to, and she could, her chest still rough, but her fever broken in the night, the warmth having done what the warmth needed to do. He got her to the entrance, helped her up the step. Then he stopped. He turned back to face Wren in the bright cold morning. He stood for a moment in the particular silence of a man who has been a craftsman for 28 years and is about to say something that costs him in proportion to what his craft has meant to him. I've built things my whole life. His voice was even the evenness of someone working through an accounting rather than performing an emotion. Good things, things I was right to be proud of. He looked past her at the hillside, at the indistinguishable line between her roof and the hill around it. I built this winter wrong. The new room, the fireplace, the flue I built the way I've always built with the materials I've always used, solving the problem I thought I was solving. A pause that held real weight. The way I've always built wasn't wrong. It wasn't complete. Wren met his eyes. When you're ready to talk about it, come in spring. Bring your notebook. It was the most professionally significant exchange Cal Briggs had participated in across 28 years of building things, and both of them understood that without either of them needing to say it. He nodded once, turned, went down the hill. Emmett Voss had already started toward the valley when he stopped. He turned back and climbed up to where Wren was standing. Doyle waited at the bottom, watching his father make the return trip. Emmett extended his hand. Wren looked at it for a moment, at the hand that had gestured her toward Yankton on the morning of her arrival, at the hand that had built the stable, now half buried in snow 40 yards from his front door. Then she took it. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes typically last, which is what happens when a handshake is doing the work that neither party has found words for yet. I said you wouldn't survive October. Emmett said, his voice carrying the quality of a man using an unfamiliar instrument with more care than usual. Then I said you wouldn't survive the winter. I was wrong both times. He held her gaze. About the dwelling, about you, about what a person is capable of when the people around them are too certain to look properly. He released her hand, went down the hill. At the bottom, Doyle fell into step beside his father, and Emmett placed his hand on his son's shoulder as they walked, the gesture carrying the weight of the frost-scraped window 2 mornings prior, the weight of what had been said there, the weight of everything a father transmits to a son in the moments when he is being honest rather than instructive. Harriet Crane was last. She stood before Wren after her husband had gone ahead with Abigail, and the silence she held at the start of it stretched past the length of comfortable silence into something that required more honesty than comfort allows. She looked at her own hands. Then she looked up. I came to your land twice. Her voice was careful, deliberate. The voice of someone who has been composing this for days and is now committed to delivering it precisely. Both times I told you what to do with your life, as though I carried the authority to know it. I assigned that authority to myself. A longer pause. I assigned it because I was frightened of something I couldn't name, and I aimed that fear at you because you were in a position where you couldn't push back. She stopped. When she resumed, her voice was lower. The child you're carrying deserved better than what I offered her mother. I am sorry for that, specifically. Wren let the silence after that be what it was, not a gap to fill, but a space the apology had earned, and that collapsing too quickly would dishonor. She looked at Harriet Crane and saw past the dark dress and the acquired authority and the gray eyes that had arrived at conclusions before they'd finished looking, the person who had been genuinely frightened of something she lacked the language for and had turned that fear outward in the direction of the least defended target available. It was not an excuse. It was an explanation, which is a different thing, and it was the first honest offering Harriet had made her. I know what it is to be frightened of something you can't name, Wren said. I've been living with that since before I got here. Harriet looked at her, a real look unfiltered by the apparatus of judgment that had preceded every previous one. What she found recalibrated something in her expression. The 17-year-old she was looking at had been alone on this hill for 8 months and had not once let anyone see how uncertain she'd been, and that required a specific kind of fortitude that Harriet had spent 8 months failing to recognize. "I'll come in spring," Harriet said. "If you'll have me." "Yes," Wren said. "Come in spring." It wasn't forgiveness dispensed from a position of grace. It was a door open to the possibility of something that would need to be built slowly with attention from the ground up. The same as everything else worth having. Harriet took her daughter's hand, went down the hill. Wren stood alone on the hillside in the bright, cold morning and looked at what the storm had done and not done. Then she went inside and slept for the first time in 3 days. March came in the way Dakota Territory springs come, not gently, not as a gift, but as a negotiation between the season that was leaving and the one that intended to replace it. The ground cycled through states until it finally committed to warming and meant it. Cal Briggs arrived on the first Thursday of March, as he had said he would, with a leather notebook and a pencil and Decker beside him. He had brought his son without announcement, which was itself the announcement. After the day the storm broke, Cal had found Decker in the evening and given him the pencil and the notebook without preamble or apology. 2 words: "Come with me." Decker had understood what those 2 words were doing the work of and had stored them in the same careful place where he stored everything that mattered. They sat on the floor of the Ridgeback Hill dwelling. Father, son, the girl who had built it, and Cal asked questions with the precision of an expert in a related field, encountering a different tradition of expertise. Not the questions of a student deferring to a teacher, but the questions of someone who knows enough to know exactly what they don't know, which is a harder position to inhabit and a more productive one. Wren answered plainly, giving him the specifics: the clay-to-grass ratio for wall sealing, the minimum depth requirements for thermal stability, how to calculate roof loading given local snow averages, why the stones beneath the stove mattered more than the stove's rated output. Decker wrote everything down as handwriting, careful his questions, occasional but well-placed, the questions of someone who has been thinking for months and knows which gaps in his understanding remain. At one point, Cal set his pencil down and said, 30 years. The tone was not bitter. It was the tone of a man completing an honest accounting. I built houses that kept the weather out mostly. You built a house that let the earth in. He picked up the pencil. I was solving the wrong problem. The recognition in those words cost him something visible, and he made no effort to hide the cost, which was perhaps the most genuinely humble thing Wren had seen from a skilled man in Harrow Flats. Not performed humility, the real thing, which has a different weight entirely. Cal came back twice more before April. Each time Decker came with him, and each time the questions went deeper, building on what the previous visit had established. By the end of the 3rd session, Cal had enough to begin the repair work on his own house, with the new principles integrated, not replacing what he knew, but extending it the way a river extends its reach when the season gives it more water to work with. Every time a settler asked Cal Briggs about the changes in his work that spring, he told them where the knowledge had come from. Not once as an obligation, every time as a fact. Emmett Voss sent a cow in April. He arrived at the base of Ridgeback Hill, with it on a rope on a Tuesday morning, climbed the slope, handed the rope to Wren with approximately the minimum number of words required to complete the transaction. He did not perform generosity. He did not require acknowledgement beyond what the exchange itself contained. The cow was in calf would deliver in May, and that calf would change Wren's daily arithmetic from sufficient to comfortable in a way that no other single addition to her resources could have managed. He was halfway down the hill when he stopped. He turned back up, not all the way, just enough to be heard clearly. "The stable is coming down. I'm redesigning the foundation before I rebuild." A pause that held something he wasn't going to put into more words than necessary. "I'd like your opinion on the below-grade approach before I start framing." "Come in spring," Wren said. "Bring your measurements." He nodded, went down. Doyle, waiting at the bottom with the horses, watched his father descend and noted the expression on his face, something he'd been watching for since the morning at the frost-scraped window. It was not a small man's expression. It was the expression of a large man who has gotten larger by accurately accounting for what he didn't know, which is a different kind of growth than what gets built with lumber. Doyle decided, without naming the decision, that this was the version of his father he intended to carry forward. Before April was out, Cal Briggs appeared at the dwelling one afternoon with something wrapped in canvas under his arm. He set it down inside without ceremony and unwrapped it a cradle made from the same quality pine he'd offered Wren in June of the previous year, and she'd declined. He had worked on it for 3 weeks longer than any single piece of furniture he'd made in years, because he was making it the way you make something for a person you owe a debt to that cannot be measured in lumber and nails. He said nothing about the debt. He touched the edge of the cradle once with one rough finger, checking the smoothness of the finish, and left. Mabel had organized her first spring transaction by the second week of March, before the ground committed to warming. A family from Illinois with a homestead claim on the North Flats, no capital a Dakota winter, ahead of them in 8 months. She walked them through the supply list with the leather notebook open on the counter, and at the end of the material discussion, she said, "There's a knowledge component. It doubles your odds of surviving your first winter. The cost is factored into the materials price, and the credit for the knowledge goes to Wren Calloway up on Ridgeback Hill, who will answer your questions directly." This was the arrangement. This was what the signed pages had meant before those pages became fuel. The family from Illinois went up Ridgeback Hill that afternoon. Wren talked with them for 2 hours, answered every question with the same directness she'd used with Cal, giving them specifics rather than theory, measurements rather than principles, because specifics can be acted on and theory requires translation. By the time they came back down, they had a construction plan. By June, they had begun digging. By the following winter, they were warm. There would be others, Mabel ensured it. The spring migration to the Dakota Territory brought new families every month from Ohio, Minnesota, Illinois, people with land and determination and insufficient understanding of what the first winter would ask of them. Mabel placed the knowledge in every conversation about materials, cited its source in every transaction, built the distribution of it into the operating logic of the mercantile, the way she'd built everything else about her operation methodically without sentimentality, because useful things deserve to be used, and knowledge that saves lives deserves to reach the people whose lives it saves. Eli Calloway was born on the 14th of April, 1883. Dorinda Voss arrived at Ridgeback Hill before first light in the particular unhurried way of someone who has been quietly prepared for this since October. She had told no one she was coming, not Emmett, not her sons, because some things belong to a different kind of knowing than the kind that requires announcement. Rowena Briggs came an hour after dawn, climbing the hill under her own power, with her chest clear in the spring air, the cough gone the way things go when what caused them is removed. She and Dorinda had arranged the practical division of labor between them over the winter months, in conversations that had grown from the 3 days in the earthen room into something that neither of them had expected, a friendship built in the specific way that friendships build between people who have been through the same extreme thing at close quarters and been honest about what they needed from each other afterward. Mabel came last. She held the lamp and said nothing, which was her form of full presence. The labor ran most of the day. It was real in every sense that word carries, not difficult as a narrative device, but difficult as a physical fact. The body doing something enormous and irreversible, demanding total presence from the person it belonged to. Wren met it the way she had met the storm, the confrontations, the 40 minutes at 2 in the morning alone in the dark, by paying complete attention, doing what could be done, accepting without performance what couldn't be managed. Dorinda was steady. Rowena was experienced. The room held its temperature without instruction. The child arrived in the late afternoon, between the last of the direct sunlight through the oiled paper windows in the long spring dusk. When Dorinda placed him on Wren's chest, his first sound was the sound of someone who has emerged from the first warmth anyone ever knows into a world that is larger and colder and more full of information than anything that came before, and has decided provisionally that this is worth investigating. Wren held him. She did not attempt to compose her face into anything in particular. Everything she had held at a measured distance since the morning she left Topeka, the weight of the closed door, the 11 days of road, the letter at the bottom of the bag, the town that had told her in every register available to it that she should not be here doing this. All of it moved through her in a single long wave that she didn't redirect. It was not grief exactly. It was the movement of something that had been suspended finally completing its fall, which is its own kind of relief. Dorinda's hand rested on her back. Wren let herself be held the same way the dwelling held everything it was asked to hold, completely without condition, without requiring that the thing being held justify its need. She named him Eli. By June, the roof garden was producing. The depth of soil above the dwelling combined with the temperature stability below it had created growing conditions that surprised even Wren, who had calculated the yield potential in advance and still found the reality exceeding the calculation. The roots went deeper than they would in surface soil. The germination rate was higher. The plants that struggled everywhere else in the valley's uncertain spring weather showed a consistency up on Ridgeback Hill that Wren attributed to the same fundamental fact that governed everything else about the structure. The ground at depth doesn't know about late frosts. People came up the hill to see it. Not just new settlers, people who had lived in Harrow Flats for years, who had tried kitchen gardens on the flatland and lost them to the temperature swings of Dakota spring. They came to look at the green things growing in a grid above the home's living ceiling, and what they saw recalibrated something in their understanding of what this place permitted. Decker Briggs had begun the dwelling on the adjacent hillside in late May. He had arrived one morning with two specific technical questions, the kind that told Wren he'd been thinking carefully and had identified precisely what he didn't know, listened to the answers, gone away, to think about them, returned with a shovel. The family he was building for had arrived from Minnesota with a claim on the eastern slope and no money and a first winter ahead of them. They were paying Decker in labor, which he had determined was sufficient because a 15-year-old in possession of genuine knowledge is capable of deciding what that knowledge is worth in a given exchange. He worked with the focused quiet of someone who has found the specific thing they know how to do and understands why it matters. Not the performance of competence, the substance of it, which looks different and sounds different and has a different quality of silence around it. On a morning in early June, before the heat of the day had established itself, Wren sat at the entrance to her dwelling with Eli asleep in the cloth carrier against her chest. The valley below was ordinary in the way that places become ordinary after they have done something extreme. The houses stood where they always had smoke. From morning fires rose into the clear air. A dog crossed the road at the valley's center. Someone's hammer struck something with the particular rhythm of deliberate construction. The cottonwoods along Coulter Creek had fully leafed. On the eastern bend of the creek, Silas Potts stood in his usual morning position at the edge of his property, watching the beaver dam with the patient attention of a man who has learned to pay the world its proper respect, and who was this morning watching the water move normally again, and noting that the animals had already begun adjusting the dam's height downward, now that the thing they'd been preparing for had passed. He did not look up toward Ridgeback Hill. He didn't need to. He already knew what was there. She watched Decker work on the hillside next to hers. The sound of his shovel in the earth was steady, unhurried carrying across the space between the two hills with the clean resonance of a sound that belongs to its environment. He had Cal's broad shoulders. He had something Cal hadn't given him, an openness to evidence that had survived contact with his father's certainty without being reshaped by it, which was its own kind of inheritance, the kind that passes between people who choose it rather than the kind that simply accrues through proximity. Eli breathed against her chest, the slow, even breathing of someone who has not yet learned to doubt the world's capacity to hold him. The knowledge was moving now. It was in Cal's notebook in Decker's hands, in the two families already building on the North Flats, with Mabel's materials and Wren's instructions. It would be in more hands before the next winter arrived, and in more still the winter after that, because knowledge that keeps people alive has a way of finding the people who need it if there is any mechanism at all for its transmission. The mechanism was a woman named Nana Sable, who had understood that the most durable form of inheritance is not property but knowledge, and had spent the 9 years available to her, giving it to the one person in her proximity who would carry it forward. The mechanism was a girl who had walked 11 days with that knowledge in her hands and a letter in her bag, and had chosen under conditions that made the choice genuinely difficult to use the knowledge rather than let the letter define the terms. The mechanism was a 15-year-old on the hillside next door, working with the seriousness of someone who has understood what the work is for. The knowledge was older than any country that had claimed this land. It was older than the names that had been placed on the territory, older than the arguments about who owned what, old as the ground itself holding its warmth through every winter that had ever pressed down on it, doing it without drama, without requiring acknowledgement, without any interest in being credited for the constancy. It had held her. She held Eli. The shovel struck the earth on the adjacent hillside, even and sure moving in the direction of the next winter and all the winters past it.